What's wrong? I was about to enter a bar to attend a New Year's party organized by Mr. Johnson, our department head, when I spotted a woman standing alone outside. That woman was Miss Smith, who had joined our department as a mid-career hire. Mr. Johnson told me that anyone who wasn't a fresh university graduate shouldn't attend. Miss Smith was in tears. Aren't mid-career hires just as valid employees? I was trembling with anger. Mr. Johnson, our department head, didn't know what happens when he makes me angry. My name is Mike Anderson. I'm 25 years old. I'm a cheerful and active guy, loving camping and fishing. I'm like this now, but it wasn't always the case. It's related to my tumultuous childhood. I lost my parents in an accident when I was young and was raised in an orphanage until I started elementary school. There were enough kids in the orphanage, and I was often teased. The teachers were too busy with other kids and never paid attention to my pleas. Gradually, I became more and more closed off to others. Just when I was getting sick of those days, a savior appeared in my life. It was my mother's parents. To me, they were my grandparents, and they had come to take me in. I had never met my grandparents before, so I had no idea who they were, but my grandfather said, "You look just like our daughter. I'm so sorry we were late in coming to get you," as he hugged me while crying. My grandmother was also in tears. I was too young to understand what was happening, but I was truly happy to be able to leave the orphanage. When we arrived at their house, my grandparents smiled at me. "From today, this is your new home, Mike. We'll buy you anything you want, and you can ask for any food you'd like." That's right. Anything you want, just tell us. My grandparents were very kind to me. And then, one day, they told me about my parents. My parents had eloped from the town after facing opposition to their marriage from my grandparents. Then they got married, and I was born. However, a few years later, they both passed away in an accident and went to heaven. It was only 5 years after my parents' death that my grandparents learned about this fact and found out about my existence. They desperately searched for where I was and eventually took me out of the orphanage. At first, I was tense and rarely showed my emotions, but my grandparents doted on me and said it was okay even if I was expressionless. Gradually, being touched by my grandparents' kindness, I started to regain my smile. My grandfather loved the outdoors and often took me fishing on weekends. "You're good at this, Mike. You're a fishing master." My grandfather always praised me, and I came to love fishing. Nurtured by my grandparents' love, I grew up well and, on their advice, entered college. I wasn't great at studying, but I understood that gaining knowledge would be useful in life, as my grandparents taught. So, I attended for 4 years and successfully graduated. Afterward, I joined my current company, where I had the good fortune to find a job. The company I work for is a major manufacturer that produces and distributes parts for cars and bicycles. I was assigned to the accounting department, where I could use the knowledge I had studied in college. As the name suggests, accounting is the department that manages the company's finances. I had studied computer skills and bookkeeping in college, but it turned out to be challenging in practice. 3 years into my job, I was working hard, but I was lucky to be blessed with kind colleagues and peers. "Mike, you should do it like this," they would advise. My senior colleague, sitting 2 seats away, Ms. Wilson, was always kind enough to help me when I didn't understand something. "I see. Got it. Thank you so much." I had been saved by Ms. Wilson many times. However, there was someone in accounting who didn't think highly of me. That person was Mr. Johnson, the head of the accounting department. Mr. Johnson, an elite boss, had studied economics at a prestigious university and even went on to graduate school. "Johnson, do you think such a sloppy document will pass? Correct it right now. This is exactly why we can't afford to have Mickey Mouse degree holders on our team." Mr. Johnson shouted loud enough for the whole office to hear. Taking the documents he threw at me, I returned to my desk and tried to find what was wrong, but I couldn't find any mistakes. Then, Miss Wilson came over and helped me review the document. Miss Wilson shook his head in confusion. "It's properly made. There are no mistakes." "What?" "So, it's true." Mr. Johnson would never be satisfied, no matter how perfect the documents I prepared were. The reason was simply that I hadn't graduated from a prestigious university. That's how Mr. Johnson looked down on me. Having no choice, I decided to have Miss Wilson submit the documents to Mr. Johnson. As expected, Mr. Johnson accepted the documents from Miss Wilson without any issue. All I could do was sigh. Then, Mr. Johnson called me over. With heavy steps, I approached Mr. Johnson's desk and was handed a massive stack of documents. Shred these documents. Even someone as incompetent as you can handle this simple task, right? Understood. I received the documents, my gaze downturned. I didn't want to say anything unnecessary. Who knows what Mr. Johnson might retort with. I decided to just do whatever Mr. Johnson asked, even if it was just menial work. But as I was carrying the documents to the shredder in the photocopy room, Mr. Johnson threw another sarcastic remark my way. "We don't need a third-rate university grad like you in this department." I continued to ignore the voice coming from behind me. I couldn't comprehend why Mr. Johnson was so persistently hostile towards me. I had continued to work hard, hoping that as I became more competent at my job, Mr. Johnson's disdain would subside. However, even after 3 years, his sarcasm and disdain seemed only to worsen. Entering the photocopy room, I methodically fed each document into the shredder. My sole consolation was the thought of the upcoming Saturday. I had plans to go fishing with my grandfather for the first time in a while. With this in mind, I decided to focus on my work for the day. Once I finished with the shredder and returned to my desk, Mr. Johnson called me over again. Another round of this. I wondered what it could be this time. Feeling apprehensive, I approached Mr. Johnson's desk. Then, he said something utterly unbelievable. "Get these documents organized by Monday." I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the sheer volume of documents Mr. Johnson had handed me. It was an enormous task, clearly impossible to complete in just one day. And today was Friday, meaning I would have to work through the weekend. I involuntarily made a displeased face, which Mr. Johnson noticed. He looked at me quizzically and said, "What? You can't do it. If you can't handle the tasks I give you, maybe you should just quit." His words drew the attention of my colleagues, who all turned to look at me. Clenching my teeth, I managed to muster a "yes, I can do it," took the documents, and headed back to my desk. Mr. Johnson laughed loudly as I walked away. I was determined not to give up. As I began sorting through the documents, Mrs. Johnson, who sat next to me, offered her help with a kind voice. "Anderson, let me help you with this. It's impossible to manage all these documents alone." She then took some papers from my desk to assist me. However, Mr. Johnson's loud voice soon echoed across the room. "Incompetent Anderson, always causing trouble for others," he sneered. I looked over at Mr. Johnson, but she ignored his comments and continued working, whispering to me, "Ignore what Mr. Johnson says." Thanks to Mrs. Johnson's help, we made significant progress, but there was still much to do. I had no choice but to work on Saturday. "Thank you so much for today. You were a big help." I thanked Mrs. Johnson as she prepared to leave at the end of the day. She smiled back warmly. "We're colleagues, after all. It's only natural to help. Mr. Johnson is just too pushy." When I got home, where my grandparents were waiting, my grandfather greeted me excitedly. "Tomorrow, I'm going fishing with Mike for the first time in a while, so I went and bought this." He was excitedly showing me a new fishing rod, the latest model I had always wanted. "Let's catch a big one with this." Nearby, my grandmother listened to our conversation with a tender smile. I looked down. "Grandpa, I'm sorry. I have to go to work tomorrow." My grandparents looked surprised at my words. Fearing I had saddened him, I cautiously looked up at my grandfather. However, he looked straight into my eyes and said quietly, "I see. Mike, you become a fine adult. If it's for work, it can't be helped. We'll go another day." I felt terribly guilty for disappointing my grandfather. Sensing my feelings, he smiled and said, "Mike, don't worry about it. The fish aren't going anywhere." I felt comforted by my grandfather's kindness. The next day, although it was Saturday, I got up early as usual to prepare for work. I went down to the living room, trying not to wake my sleeping grandparents, and was greeted by a wonderful smell. As I entered the living room, I saw my grandfather reading the newspaper on the sofa, and my grandmother had prepared a delicious breakfast on the dining table. They had gotten up early knowing I had to work on Saturday. "You need to eat something nutritious to get through the workday," my grandmother said with a smile. "Do your best at work today. We might only be able to support you in spirit." "Thank you." I expressed my heartfelt gratitude to my grandparents. After enjoying a delicious breakfast, I headed to the office. Given it's Saturday, the trains and roads are less crowded. When I arrived in front of the company, I noticed a woman standing in front of the building, writing notes in a notebook. She seemed to be about my age, with her long black hair tied back, wearing a suit. I wondered what she was doing. Curious, I decided to approach her. "Is there something wrong?" The woman looked startled upon seeing me. "Oh, are you an employee of this company?" "Yes, I am," I replied. She seemed panicked and accidentally dropped her pen. I picked up the pen and handed it back to her. "I'm sorry." "Thank you so much. My name is Emily Smith. Starting Monday, I'll be working in the accounting department of this company. I came here today to check the location," Miss Smith explained. "Oh, is that so? I'm also in the accounting department. I look forward to working with you from Monday." Upon hearing this, Smith said goodbye and left. I thought to myself that she seemed like a very conscientious person. As I entered the office, thanks to Ms. Wilson's help yesterday, I was able to finish the work in just a few hours. I decided to buy a cake for my grandparents and headed home. The next day, when I went to work, I saw Ms. Wilson trying to move a desk all by herself, looking quite busy. I quickly placed my bag on my desk and went to help Ms. Wilson. "Hey Mike, thanks for the help. We've got a new mid-career hire starting today. She's a high school graduate, so I'm hoping she doesn't get on Mr. Johnson's bad side," Miss Wilson remarked with a look of concern. "So, Miss Smith is a high school graduate, but she seems sincere, so I'm sure she'll manage," I thought optimistically. However, it wasn't long before I realized this assumption was a bit naive. A while later, Mr. Johnson arrived at the office. I submitted the documents I had completed during my Saturday shift. Surprisingly, Mr. Johnson tossed them onto his desk without even looking at them. "I'll check these later." Mr. Johnson seemed to be in a foul mood from the morning, causing everyone in the office to be on edge. Then Miss Smith entered the accounting department and walked over to Mr. Johnson's desk to introduce herself. I'm Emily Smith, and I'll be starting work here today," she said in a timid, quiet voice to Mr. Johnson. However, Mr. Johnson glared at her. "What? Speak up. I can't hear a word you're saying." Miss Smith, looking like she was about to cry, repeated her greeting, this time louder. Mr. Johnson watched her with a snort of derision. "Honestly, we didn't really need a high school graduate like you in this department, but I reluctantly agreed to take you on. Be grateful," he said. "Yes, sir," Miss Smith replied meekly. Miss Smith was clearly terrified of Mr. Johnson. Everyone in the department watched the scene in stunned silence. I couldn't fathom what Mr. Johnson was thinking, treating Miss Smith like that on her first day. I was filled with anger inside. "For now, you'll be the accounting department's errand runner. Once you've perfected that, then I'll teach you your actual job." I couldn't believe my ears. An errand runner in the accounting department. That was unheard of. "Errand runner," Miss Smith echoed, clearly confused. And no wonder, she had joined a company mid-career to work in accounting. Mr. Johnson, growing angrier that Miss Smith hadn't responded loudly, raised his voice further. "Hey, if you can hear me, respond loudly. That's how it works in the professional world. If you don't even know that, you shouldn't have joined this company." He clicked his tongue in annoyance and left the office. Miss Smith, looking on the verge of tears, was staring down at the floor. Just as I was about to go and speak to her, several colleagues, including Wilson, approached her. "Don't worry about what Mr. Johnson said. We're happy to have you join us." "That's right. Mr. Johnson is an expert at looking down on people. Let's prove him wrong through our work." A small smile returned to Miss Smith's face. I felt relieved. After a while, Mr. Johnson returned to the office and called me and Miss Smith. I thought he was going to dump more menial work on us, and sure enough, he came up with something unbelievable. "Today, the executive vice president is coming for an inspection. Make sure every corner of the office is spotless." "Understood." I exchanged glances with Miss Smith, who stood next to me, both of us in shock. Normally, Cleaning staff hired by the company take care of the cleaning, so we didn't need to do it ourselves. Confused, I couldn't help but speak up. Mr. Johnson, the cleaning staff will take care of the cleaning, so I don't think we need to do it. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted it. Mr. Johnson's face began to turn red with anger. You're useless, so I gave you a job you can handle, and yet you dare to talk back. Understood. Miss Smith and I began cleaning every nook and cranny of the department as directed by Mr. Johnson. By the afternoon break, we finally finished and took a moment to rest. Mr. Anderson, I'm sorry to have dragged you into this, Emily said, looking remorseful. It's not your fault, Miss Smith. Mr. Johnson just doesn't like that I graduated from a less prestigious university, and that's why he treats me badly. That's just how he is. So, he dislikes me because I'm a high school graduate. No matter how hard I try, it seems like it will never be enough, Emily lamented, looking downcast. I remembered feeling the same way as Emily when I first joined the company. No, I believe that hard work will be rewarded someday. This is something my beloved grandfather used to say. Emily nodded in response to my words. After the break, we returned to the office where the executive vice president was already conducting his inspection. Mr. Johnson, unlike his usual low and intimidating tone, was using a higher, more pleasant voice. Upon seeing Emily, the executive vice president immediately said, "You must be Emily, who just joined us today. Work hard, I'm counting on you." Unlike Mr. Johnson, the executive vice president was kind to Emily, and she seemed taken aback by this different treatment. After the inspection, the executive vice president left the office. Then, Emily was seemingly called over by Mr. Johnson. Observing the situation, it appeared that Mr. Johnson was again raising his voice at Emily. The executive vice president might have expectations of you, but I have none. Don't get the wrong idea. Yes, sir. Her gaze falling to the floor once again. I couldn't understand why Mr. Johnson was so harsh even towards the unresisting Emily. I was beyond angry. I was shocked. Such days continued, and the seasons were turning towards spring. The office was somewhat noisy. Today, there was a New Year's party organized by Mr. Johnson after work. It's the first time Mr. Johnson is hosting a New Year's party, but I have a bad feeling about this, Miss Wilson said with a sigh. I had the same ominous feeling as Ms. Wilson. We had had drinking parties before, but never one hosted by Mr. Johnson. However, Emily seemed happy about it. I've only been doing odd jobs every day and haven't had the chance to get close to everyone. I would be happy if I could bond with everyone at this New Year's party, she said with a smile. Everyone is nice here. You'll surely get along well with them. Indeed. Today, even Mr. Johnson seemed to be in a good mood. Anderson, these documents are perfect. Thank you, sir. After 3 years at the company, I had never heard a word of approval from Mr. Johnson. Something felt off, but I hoped I was just overthinking it. Little did I know that my suspicions would later prove to be correct. When it was time to leave, I still hadn't finished the task Mr. Johnson had assigned me. Anderson, I'm heading off first, Miss Wilson said, getting up from her desk. I'll be there soon, I replied, rushing to finish my work. Then Emily approached me. Let's go together, Anderson, she said with a bright smile. However, I still had work to finish. I'll take a bit longer. Please go ahead. Okay, I'll save you a seat, she said, leaving the office. Emily was looking forward to the party, and I didn't want to hold her up because of my delay. 30 minutes later, I finally finished my work and hurried to the izakaya. Upon arrival, I was shocked to see Emily outside the pub, her eyes red from crying. As I was about to ask Emily what happened, Ms. Wilson came out of the pub, looking like she was ready to leave. What happened, Miss Smith? Emily didn't respond, and Ms. Wilson, visibly angry, spoke up. What happened? I'm so angry with Mr. Johnson. Let's go home, Emily. Then Emily, tears in her eyes, quietly said, Mr. Johnson told me that anyone who wasn't a fresh university graduate shouldn't attend. I was stunned. How could Mr. Johnson be so cruel? Emily had been working diligently every day, even though she was unjustly assigned to menial tasks. Mid-career hires are just as valid employees. What right did Mr. Johnson have to act so high and mighty? I had reached my breaking point. Miss Wilson was trying to lead the crying Emily away, but I stopped them and made a phone call to someone who could silence Mr. Johnson. After the call, I urged them to go back into the pub. Anderson, we can go back in there now. If we do, Mr. Johnson will just say more awful things to Emily. Miss Wilson protested, clearly confused. Emily's face turned to tears again. I can't do this anymore. I'll quit my job. I looked intently at Emily, who was on the verge of giving up. Miss Smith, are you really okay with quitting just like that? Haven't you endured so much up to now? If you quit, doesn't that mean Mr. Johnson wins? But, as a high school graduate, I can never get Mr. Johnson's approval. I sighed. I have a plan. Just leave this to me. Both Ms. Wilson and Emily nodded in agreement. We entered the pub, and as expected, Mr. Johnson noticed us and raised his voice. Smith, didn't I tell you there's no place for you here? If it bothers you that much, go graduate from a prestigious university. Mr. Johnson, slightly intoxicated, was being as offensive as he pleased. Ignoring his words, the three of us took our seats in the tatami area. Our colleagues looked on in surprise. Hey, don't just sit down like you own the place. Well, I'll forgive Wilson, but Smith and Anderson, why don't you two just go home together? You're a perfect match, Mr. Johnson said, half-jokingly, but no one was laughing. Then Ms. Wilson, having reached her breaking point, finally raised her voice against Mr. Johnson. I will go home with them. Who do you think you are, Mr. Johnson? I've been patient so far, but I've had enough. Mr. Johnson, tipsy, was taken aback. He probably never expected the usually compliant Ms. Wilson to stand up to him. But then he quickly became angry. What? I am the director. Who are you to defy me? If you're going to defy me, then don't bother coming in tomorrow. Mr. Johnson was spouting his usual harsh words, but everything was going as expected. I confronted Mr. Johnson with a firm tone. Mr. Johnson, you don't have the authority to fire employees on a whim. It might be better to refrain from making such rash statements about firing staff. How dare you? I'm the director. I have the authority. It's not your place to question me. You're fired too. My colleagues, watching the scene, were visibly shocked, covering their mouths in disbelief. As everyone watched in tense silence, the door to the pub burst open, and 3 men entered. We will not tolerate the unjust dismissal of our valuable employees. What? The chairman. Mr. Johnson's eyes widened in shock, rendered speechless. The pub erupted into murmurs and surprise. The man who had just entered was, in fact, the chairman of the company I worked for. Continuing loudly, the chairman declared, "And to think, you were about to fire my own grandson." Your grandson? Sorry I'm late, Mike, the chairman said, looking at me with a smile. Mr. Johnson turned pale upon realizing the chairman was my grandfather. Indeed, my grandfather was the founder of this large manufacturing company, and currently its chairman. I hadn't known what my grandfather did for a living until I was a senior in college. It was then, while searching for a job, that he approached me, asking me to take over the company, revealing his position for the first time. Suddenly asked to inherit a company, I felt incapable and unsure. So, I decided to keep my identity a secret and blend in with the other employees until the time was right to reveal myself and build my skills. Only the executive vice president and the president knew I was the chairman's grandson. I had never mentioned Mr. Johnson's arrogant behavior to my grandfather, but reaching my limit, I called and told him about it, asking him to come to the New Year's party. My grandfather was surprised but promised to come right away. Mike, I'm sorry I didn't realize what was happening. It's my responsibility for not supervising properly. The president, standing behind my grandfather, looked at me apologetically, and the executive vice president nodded in agreement. Mike is the chairman's grandson. I had no idea. He's really incompetent, always causing problems in the accounting department. Problems? I was surprised, as I had no recollection of causing any trouble. The executive vice president immediately responded, "Can we stop referring to Mike as this guy? He's going to be the future president of our company. Mr. Johnson, you are not in a position to speak so casually to him. Know your place." With those words, Mr. Johnson took a step back. "Yes, I'm sorry," he said. his demeanor suddenly subdued. I didn't consider myself exceptionally skilled, but I was sure I hadn't caused any trouble for my colleagues. I wanted my grandfather to know that. Mr. Johnson, you're saying I've been a nuisance in the accounting department, right? That's not true, is it? Please retract your statement. Mr. Johnson looked flustered by my words, clearly agitated. What are you talking about? I haven't lied, he insisted stubbornly. I was fed up. That's when Miss Smith raised her voice. Mr. Anderson has never been a nuisance to anyone. On the contrary, he's been kind to everyone, even to me, despite the fact that Mr. Johnson made fun of me for only being a high school graduate. I was so grateful for how he treated me. The one lying here is Mr. Johnson. Miss Smith, out of breath, desperately appealed to the executives. What? Keep quiet. You're just a high school graduate. Don't get so full of yourself. That's what I dislike high school graduates, retorted Mr. Johnson. The executives, including my grandfather, looked at Mr. Johnson in disbelief. Realizing the gravity of his own words, Mr. Johnson began to panic. My grandfather said heavily, "You've been making such snide remarks to juniors, I see. I understand now. No, this is different." Mr. Johnson, now in a clear state of panic, replied. Then Ms. Wilson and other colleagues also began to speak. Mr. Johnson, you've always been like this, making nasty remarks, especially to Miss Smith and Mr. Anderson. You were terrible to them, making them do odd jobs, work on Saturdays. It was totally unacceptable. Everyone was united in their criticism of Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson looked like he could say nothing more. Then my grandfather nodded and said, "Mr. Johnson, it seems you're not suitable for our company. Maybe you should work elsewhere, though I suspect they might not want you either." Mr. Johnson looked utterly defeated. So, does this mean that I am? Indeed, I would have preferred to fire him, but let's have Mike Anderson, our next president, decide. Everyone in the restaurant turned their attention to me. I had already made up my mind. Mr. Johnson looked at me with pleading eyes. I agree. It would be best to fire him. Hearing my words, Mr. Johnson seemed to collapse and sat down on the spot. Then, with a weak voice, he begged, "Anderson, please, spare me this one thing." Mr. Johnson began to prostrate himself right there, but my mind was unchanged. "It's too late. You had plenty of chances to change your behavior, didn't you? Yet, you were harsh in your words and actions towards me and Miss Smith. I simply cannot forgive that. I'm truly sorry." Despite hearing my words, it seemed Mr. Johnson couldn't give up. "Apologizing isn't just to me, right? Please give a proper apology to Miss Smith too," I said. Mr. Johnson turned and also knelt to apologize to Miss Smith. "For now, we'll inform Mr. Johnson of his future treatment later. Until then, he should wait. Mike and Miss Smith, continue working hard for our company." "Yes, understood," Miss Smith and I replied loudly. Meanwhile, Mr. Johnson remained downcast. After that, the New Year's party with the executives resumed, and everyone enjoyed drinking and eating, turning it into a very enjoyable event. A few days later, Mr. Johnson, due to his inappropriate behavior towards subordinates, was officially fired. However, realizing he would be dismissed, Mr. Johnson decided to resign on his own. On his last day, Mr. Johnson left the company quietly without saying goodbye to anyone. If only he had been kinder to everyone, this outcome could have been avoided. I hope that going forward, everyone will cherish those around them. This document, though, here's how it should be done. Miss Smith is energetically performing her long-desired accounting work. With Mr. Johnson gone, there's a renewed sense of vitality in the office. I am working hard every day, preparing to take over my grandfather's company.